Okay, so quick review. We're starting chapter 8. And beginning at chapter 8, Paul turns his attention to questions regarding the offering or the eating of food that had been sacrificed to idols. That's a subject that's going to occupy him all the way through chapter 11, verse 1. And as I said last week, his primary focus, it's on the Corinthians' participation in the idol feasts. They're eating meat in the pagan temples as part of the sacrificial ritual that was performed for the pagan gods. And at the end of last class, I was sharing with you Gordon Fee's reconstruction of the situation. He's a commentator. He's dead now, but he's a very well-known New Testament scholar. And I think he's right that after Paul left Corinth, some of the Christians there in Corinth, they returned to the practice of attending those cultic meals, those idol feasts, which they had probably done all their lives. But they returned to it, and in his earlier letter, the letter that's mentioned in chapter 5, Paul forbid such idolatry. But at least some in the congregation apparently took exception to Paul's trying to stop them from participating in these idol feasts. And in their letter back to him, arguments were presented, whether they were presented by those writing or Paul was informed that, hey, there are some here who are claiming this. But arguments were presented that Paul's prohibition of their attending the idol feast, that was unjustified. And they argued that all have knowledge about idols. And since there's only one God, the idols can't be real gods, so we're not really worshiping. It's simply a social matter because we know these things have no substance. That's one of the things. And they also said, look, they also have knowledge that food is a matter of indifference to God. And they seem to have this magical view of baptism and participation in the Lord's Supper, claiming that those who'd been baptized and who take the Lord's Supper, that they were immune from falling, that they were not in any danger of falling, so the prohibition is not really necessary. And a number of them also seem to doubt that Paul has the proper apostolic authority to forbid them in this matter. Now, those who are pushing to eat the temple meals, they're probably arguing that, look, this is a matter of Christian liberty, as they claim. It's not, but they're claiming this to Paul. This is a matter of Christian liberty, and in fact, other people will be built up. They will be built up by taking authority in this matter, by joining in the idol feast. And in any event, they pressed for the right to do this in the name of knowledge, and they probably invited brothers and sisters to join them in the idol feast. See, to experience their liberty in Jesus. Okay, chapter 8, here we go. Now, about things sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone thinks he has come to know something, he has not yet come to know as he needs to know. But if anyone loves, this one truly knows. You see that little asterisk? That's because there's a textual issue. I'll talk about that in a minute. Concerning then the eating of things sacrificed to idols. We know that there is no idol in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are those called gods, either in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, but for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and we are for him. And one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and we are through him. So Paul, he opens his attack on their objection to his prohibition of attending the idol feast by challenging its faulty ethical premise. He challenges that. The assumption behind the argument that they're making is that Christian behavior is predicated solely on knowledge. That knowing that something is not forbidden, that knowing that something is a matter of liberty, that then automatically authorizes one to do it in all circumstances. And Paul's point in this section, and you got to listen to this. What he's saying is, this is a teaching opportunity for Paul. Okay, his point in this section is that, look, even if your arguments about the propriety of eating in the temples were correct, they're not correct. Eating in the idol temples is idolatry, and it is sinful, and Paul makes no question about that in chapter 10, verses 14 to 22. He makes it perfectly clear that it's sinful. But he's going along with them now for a teaching opportunity where they're arguing, no, Paul, it's really a matter of Christian liberty. And Paul then says, okay, let's go with that. And so he says, look, even if your arguments about the propriety of eating in the idol feast were true, even if it was a matter of Christian liberty pursuant to your arguments, okay, the principle of brotherly love would still require that you forego the practice. Okay, so what they're doing, it's sinful. He's going to make that clear. He's made it clear in his prior letter to them. But they're arguing to him, no, it's really a matter of Christian liberty. So now he says, okay, let's assume you're right. You still would have to forego the practice out of brotherly love. You see, I want you to understand the structure of what's going on here. So Paul, he accepts the Corinthians' point that all Christians possess knowledge, but as verse 7 makes clear, Paul realizes that there are varying levels of that knowledge, or there are varying degrees of internalization of that knowledge. And he breaks off his comment where he says, now about the things sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. And then he breaks off that comment to attack the concept of knowledge as it's being represented there in Corinth. Knowledge by itself, okay? Knowledge by itself without any other guiding principles, it simply puffs a person up. It puffs the person up. It causes him to see himself as superior to other people and then to run roughshod over those who are beneath him. See, they are the ignorant. They are the unenlightened who are not worth worrying about. See, so in the abstract, knowledge without guiding principles simply puffs a person up. Whereas love, on the other hand, love builds up the community of faith. Love focuses on the welfare of one's brothers and sisters. One is concerned about one's brothers and sisters. And alluding to the knowledge that some were claiming authorized their attending these idol feasts, Paul says that anyone who thinks he's in the know on such a matter, that he does not know as he needs to know. Such a person thinks he has gained knowledge about, well, we're free to go ahead and participate in these idol feasts because we all have knowledge that there is only one God. He says such a person has gained knowledge, but true knowledge has escaped him. It's escaped him because he's overlooked the essential role of love. He's divorced knowledge from love. As I said, there's a textual issue in verse 3. And the shorter text, which is the one I think is probably, when I say a textual issue, what do I mean? Well, this is one of those rare circumstances where we can't be certain. There are decent arguments both ways of what the Spirit actually inspired Paul to say. Did Paul write this under the inspiration of the Spirit, or did he write the longer thing I'm going to talk about in a second? And you can see, now this shorter reading, this has good manuscript support in early witnesses. In fact, the oldest manuscript we have, Papyrus 46, has the short reading here. You see this, it's reflected in the writings of Clement of Alexandria. He was familiar with this reading in the late 2nd century. And that reads, if anyone loves, this one truly knows. And that reinforces the point that love is part of true knowing. That's what I think Paul is saying. Love is part of true knowing. And that reading, in my judgment, it better fits the context, and it's favored. It's not some wild idea. It's favored by a number of commentators. Gordon Fee, Anthony Thistleton, the textual critic Philip Comfort. And if you're interested in such things, the most recent and thorough defense of the short reading is a 2016 article by Mark Liteny in the Journal of Biblical Literature. So I think this is the right reading. I think this is what the Spirit inspired Paul to write. But the longer text, if I'm wrong on that, the longer text of verse 3 is that, but if anyone loves, see it says, but if anyone loves, well the longer text is, but if anyone loves God. Okay, but if anyone loves God, this person has been known by him, has been known by God. So if anyone loves God, this person has been known by God. And if that's the correct reading, if that's what the Spirit inspired Paul to write, well then Paul here reminds them that their love for God means that they are known by God in the sense of they are special to Him as recipients of His saving grace. So there's this special relationship. You're a Christian, you're known by God. You love God, you're known by God. There's this special relationship, and he reminds them of that because that sets them apart from worshipers of false gods, and it limits what they may and may not do. And as David Garland says, those who love God and are known by God may not dally in the shrines of other gods. You see, participating in these idol feasts, those who are loved by God and have this special relationship with God may not dally in those shrines. So either way, he's telling them not to get at that. But I think this is more in tracking, and so you can argue that. So I give you both of those. Now, having interjected a qualifying word about the way of love superseding the way of knowledge, Paul then in verse 4, he picks back up where he began in verse 1, and he naturally agrees with the Corinthian position that there is no idol in the world in the sense of being a god. Right? There's no idol in the world if by that you mean that this is a god. Okay, he would agree with that, and he would agree that there is no God but one. I mean, that's a standard monotheistic confession. So, of course, he would agree with that. And the fact there's only one God means that the idols of the pagan world cannot be gods. Now, as Paul's going to specify later in chapter 10, there are demons that are very much involved with these idols and these things that are worshipped as gods. But they're not gods, right? They're animated, or demons are in the background of this whole mythological structure that exists. But they are not gods. And then Paul begins verse 5 with the phrase, for even if there are those called gods. Even if there are those called gods, meaning things that are not really gods, but are called gods by people. But he doesn't finish that sentence. Right? It seems he was going to say, look, even if there are many so-called gods, they don't really exist, at least not as they are portrayed. Okay, it looks like that's what Paul is going to say, but instead of completing his thought, he interjects an acknowledgement of the fact that there are many gods, meaning the traditional Greco-Roman gods, and there are many lords, referring to the deities of the Oriental mystery cults. See, they were everywhere in the ancient world. There were shrines and temples. This stuff was all over the place. So Paul, he understands. Of course, there are many of these gods in that sense, these so-called gods, these Greco-Roman deities. But Paul isn't saying that these deities really exist, at least not as deities. Right? Not as deities. Again, in chapter 10, verses 19 and 20, he's going to talk about that it's a demonic thing. You see, but they don't exist as deity. He's simply saying that people believe they exist. There are many so-called gods, and who could deny that? Right? All kinds. Zeus, Apollo, you got all kinds of gods there, many. And he grants that there are many so-called gods and lords, but that's true only for pagans. Only the pagans, those who are not in the know, who believe that they are in fact gods. They believe the mythology that is fed to them about who's creating this and attributing these works to these gods. But Christians know better, at least intellectually. Christians know better. For us, there's only one God, right, from whom all things have been made, and there's only one Lord through whom all things have been made. One God, from whom, one Lord, through whom, and you see the unity of the Father and the Son, the unity of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. You see, it's hinted at, right? In the unity of purpose and action of the divine work of creation, especially in light of the standard Jewish confession, the Lord our God. The Lord our God is one Lord. Lord, God, Lord. You see Paul here, there's this hint, right, of the Trinity here. Or at least dealing with the Father and the Son. David Garland, in his commentary, says, Paul creatively Christianizes the foundational Jewish monotheistic confession, the Lord our God is one Lord, Deuteronomy 6:4. He glosses the reference to Lord and God in that confession so that God refers to the Father and Lord refers to Christ. You see, one God, unity. And I think you see that hinted at there. But then in 7-13 he says, but this knowledge is not in everyone. Now he said we all know, but now he's saying, wait a minute, this knowledge is not in everyone. Some, by reason of being accustomed until now to the idol. Okay, some, by reason of being accustomed until now to the idol, eat the meat as a thing sacrificed to an idol. They don't eat the meat as a purely social matter, absolutely convinced that there's no reality to the idol. They eat as sacrifice to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, being underdeveloped, is defiled. Now, food will not present us to God, neither if we do not eat are we inferior, nor if we eat do we excel. But watch out, lest somehow this authority of yours becomes a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you, the one having knowledge, reclining at a table in an idol's temple, okay? So this is what I'm telling you. We're talking about participating in these idol feasts. He sees you reclining at a table in an idol's temple. Will not his conscience, which is weak, be built up to eat the things sacrificed to idols? For the one who is weak is destroyed by your knowledge, the brother for whom Christ died. And by sinning this way against the brothers and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat forevermore, so that I not cause my brother to stumble. So all the Corinthian Christians, as Christians, they knew intellectually, or they knew theoretically, that there is only one God. But not all of them had internalized that knowledge at the same emotional or experiential level. They understood it, but they hadn't internalized that at the same level. They were so used to associating with the idol as a god. All their life they've done that. They were so trained in that and so used to associating with the idol as a god that they could not return to their former place of worship and join in the temple meal without some sense of feeling that the idol to whom the food was offered was real, that this idol was in fact a rival god. And they couldn't get away and escape that internal feeling that they had. In other words, because of the relative weakness, the underdevelopment of their monotheistic convictions, they could not participate in the temple feasts as a purely social matter. For them, it was at some level engaging in the worship of an idol. And the practice, therefore, it defiled their consciences. It violated their sense of loyalty to the one true God. You see, so I come in here and I'm not really on board with this. I know intellectually that there's only one God, but I'm so associated with this God through my life. When I go in and participate in these idol feasts, I feel guilty. I'm being disloyal to God, and my conscience is violated. Now in verse 8, it's a reference to a Corinthian claim. Look, that food is a matter of indifference to God. So he's not going to care about us eating here in the idol feast. It's a matter of indifference to God. And they probably had taken something that Paul said about the irrelevance of Jewish food laws and converted that into a justification for eating food sacrificed to idols. Okay, taking it from Paul and converting it to their use, that helps explain the imprecise fit of the phrase in their argument. I mean, the phrase makes the point either way that, look, food is a matter of irrelevance to God. But it doesn't fit very precisely with their argument, because you'd expect them to claim that abstaining did not make one superior. See, they're advocating going ahead and participating. So you'd expect them to say, look, abstaining from the idol feast doesn't make one superior, and eating the idol feast doesn't make one inferior. But it says the opposite. You see, and I think that's why they've recruited a statement from Paul that still makes the point that eating food is a matter of indifference, but it doesn't fit very squarely with their position, and I think that's what's happening there. And then in verse 9, it shows that verse 8, at least to me, it shows that it's part of the Corinthian argument against Paul, because he cites their claim, and then he counters with, but watch out. I say, look, we know that food is a matter of indifference to God. He cites that, but then Paul says, but watch out, lest somehow this authority of yours, this idea that you're claiming that you have the freedom to go and participate in these idol feasts, that it becomes a stumbling block, you see. Watch out that it becomes a stumbling block to the weak. And by misapplying this general freedom that Christians have regarding Jewish food laws, it would become a stumbling block for others. You see, and then Paul explains. He says, look, for if the one with a weak conscience, now here meaning again, with an underdeveloped sense of monotheistic conviction, okay? One with a weak conscience, weak in terms of those monotheistic convictions. If somebody like that sees them, okay, probably, by the way, by invitation to join, right? Here these people are saying, listen, we understand, we're liberated, and we understand that it's okay for us to eat in these, the idol's nothing we can eat here, despite what Paul said. We can go ahead and eat. Come on. Yeah, it'll be good for you. It will be good for you to build up, your understanding of Christian liberty and this kind of stuff. So I'm thinking probably there, but he says if somebody there, if that person there sees them eating in the idol's temple, they'll have that person will have his conscience built up. Okay, that's probably what they were saying to get them to come there, but it's a bit of irony there, built up to eat the things sacrificed to idols. In other words, they will be moved to participate in idolatry. That's what it is for them. They'll be moved to participate in idolatry. The weak one, he doesn't simply eat food. He eats food sacrificed to idols, because that is so deeply ingrained in him, and that is what he's doing when he winds up eating. And that's why Paul says in verse 11, for the one who is weak is destroyed by your knowledge. He's destroyed by your knowledge. See, by their so-called knowledge, what they would be doing in that case is that they would be pushing the brother for whom Christ died. They would be pushing that brother or sister to eternal ruin. You see, pressuring someone to act in violation of their conscience can destroy them spiritually by beginning a hardening process, by beginning a searing of one's conscience, which leads to alienation from God. It is no trivial thing to violate your conscience. I don't care how malformed it is. Right? If you believe this is wrong and God would not have you do this and you do it, that's bad. Because what you're doing is you're searing that conscience. And that leads to and that's what Paul is concerned about here. That ultimately you may destroy this person by doing this. And Paul makes the same point in a different context. In Romans chapters 14 and 15, especially you see in verse 14, 15. And so in Romans, so you see in the second part of it, do not by your food destroy that one for whom Christ died. Now here in Romans 14 and 15, he requires Christians there to abstain from eating meat in the presence of the Jewish brother whose conscience was not free to eat the meat. Now there Paul is clear that this is in fact a matter of liberty. In 1 Corinthians 8, Paul is only assuming it's a matter of liberty for the sake of argument, because to tell them it's not a matter of liberty. But because you're claiming it is, let me take this moment to teach you about brotherly love. Okay, but there it is a matter of liberty, but he still tells them, he says, look, you must refrain from doing that in the face of the Jewish brother who believes that it's sinful to do it. Or he's at least not there yet, that he would experience some guilt in doing it. You can't push him into that in that way. And here he puts aside the issue. As I say, he puts that aside of whether participating in the idol feast in the temple, whether that's morally acceptable. He's going to treat it as though it's a matter of liberty until he makes clear in 10:14-22 that it's not. But he's just assuming that it is for the purpose of argument. And so he said, look, even if that were the case, they would still be required by love to abstain from doing it in the presence of a brother whose conscience was not free to do so. So let's say you're right about that eating in the idol feast, there's no God, we all know that stuff. You're saying it's a matter of Christian liberty. Even if it is, you still cannot do it in the presence of a brother or sister who's not there yet. So you can't do that. By sinning against the brothers in this way, by eating the temple meals in their presence in the name of enlightened freedom. Well, they ought to know better. Grow up. You see, by doing that, so as to pressure them to violate their idol-sensitive consciences, their weak consciences. By pressuring them to do that, they are sinning against Christ himself. He so identifies with Christians that when you treat a brother with an underdeveloped conscience like that and push him to violate his conscience, you're sinning against Christ himself. So it really is serious business. And given what Paul has just said, he in verse 13, he sums up with a declaration that the principle of love, put in the context of eating. All right, that's what he says here. Therefore, he sums up with this declaration of the principle of love. He puts it in the context of eating. He says, if food causes my brother to stumble, I'll never eat meat forevermore. How dare you, Paul, refrain from exercising your liberty? Paul says, listen, what I'm concerned about is the welfare of my brothers and sisters. I'll never eat meat again. if you're telling me the consequence of my doing it is going to be to harm them, they're more precious to me than any meat I'll ever eat. And so he says there, so that I not cause my brother to stumble. So Paul is not so concerned with his right to eat something, his knowledge that it's permissible, that he will insist on doing that to the detriment of brothers and sisters. Now, this broader statement and shift to the first person, that leads to the following section. But I want to say a bit about this principle of refraining from conduct that one has liberty to engage in, refraining from it in the presence of brothers and sisters who aren't there. You see, for the sake of their consciences. Now, this is something that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 8. He says it in 14 and 15. It's important. He says that neglecting it may lead to the destruction of your brother and sister. Okay, now we are deadly afraid of this. We are deadly afraid of this. And it's because we fear, listen, if we take this seriously, what it will mean is that we are held hostage to the narrowest conscience in the group. We're going to be trapped. We're going to be hostage to cranks. And so basically we ignore it and do kind of an ad hoc thing. When somebody doesn't like something, we just say, well, you can't do that, can't do that. Instead of trying to find what are guiding principles of what Paul is saying that will make it more clear to us. When do we apply it? When do we not? And I have some things, I've talked about this at length in other classes. I'm not going to give you the full show and get detoured off of 1 Corinthians and go into that. But I do want to say some limitations of the principle of deferring to the narrower conscience of a brother or sister who's in your presence. Okay? The first is that Paul is speaking about genuine matters of conscience, not matters of preference. We got preferences about everything. Right? When should we take the Lord's Supper and how many songs and what kind of songs and what color should the wall be and all this stuff. Preferences everywhere. Everybody's got preferences. Okay? But that's not what we're talking about. Right? That doesn't come into play. We're only talking about something somebody's convinced the Lord has called them to do. It's something the Lord has placed on them, an obligation from the Lord, they believe. So that's the first thing you see that limits the principle. So you wind up having that. So it's something that involves a sense of guilt. Not anger because people disagree with you and they're not doing what you want. You just got to learn to live with that. Right? That's part of living among people. You know, people have all kinds of things, and you ask any of the shepherds, I'm sure. You know, trying to you have the responsibility of making all these decisions, and there's not a decision you can make that's going to please everybody. Okay? That simply will not happen. And so they just have to do the best they can. But on all these matters of preferences, we as the flock, you simply have to say, okay, I'm thankful there's somebody who's willing to wrestle with this and do the best they can. Okay? And they do the best they can. So, okay, it's not at the level of my conscience. So I want to roll easy. Anything that's not the level of my conscience. Okay? I want to do that. So now here now also, like this is how you say, well, it's a matter of conscience, not preference. But you know that one can assent to a truth intellectually, but still have a restriction of conscience that's rooted in one's life experience. And that's what's really happening here in Corinth. The intellectual understanding has not yet been internalized. It has sunk into the heart. And that has to be respected also. That has to be respected. Now, you may be better able to recognize. You say, well, how is that possible that I can have an intellectual understanding and agreement of something, but still have something? Well, let me give you an example that I think will show it, you know. You think of a soldier who accepts intellectually that killing is morally acceptable, that it is morally justified in a just war. Now, you can have a person who understands that. He may know the reasoning behind that. He may have wrestled with the theology of it and all that and be convinced, yes, that's the right position and the right understanding, and may find it intellectually persuasive, and yet still be unable to kill with a clear conscience. Right? There's something else going on at a deep level that this understanding here has not yet sunk down so that he can kill with a clear conscience. Okay, I just give that to you because when I say that it's a matter of conscience, not preference, I want us to at least be aware of the fact that sometimes conscience can be more complicated than simply saying, yes, I understand that. And that's what was going on here. They all know intellectually, theoretically, there's only one God. But when they go into that idol, that temple, baby, and they're doing what they did all their lives, I'm worshiping a rival God. And it harms their conscience. And the second thing is that he's speaking about conduct, not teaching. Conduct that is done in the presence of the brother or sister with the narrower conscience. Conduct done in the presence of the brother or sister with the narrower conscience. That's why in Romans chapter 14, verse 22, he tells those with a broader conscience to keep the convictions they have to themselves before God. And why in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 10, he speaks of the one who sees them in the temple. Who sees them in the temple. See, Christians are free to enjoy the liberty they have in Christ when they are away from their brothers and sisters who have a narrower conscience. Indeed, Paul in Romans chapter 14, verse 22, the second part, he labels as blessed. Blessed is the man who can enjoy his liberty with a clear conscience. And the restriction, it's limited to being in the other person's presence. Presumably, he doesn't spell that out. If he sees him, you see, keep between yourself and God. There's a sense of doing it in a person's presence. Well, why is it restricted to that? And I think it's restricted to that because doing something in someone's presence increases the pressure on that person to engage in that conduct before they can get the consent of their conscience. To engage in that conduct before they're actually ready. See, teaching someone that a belief is incorrect, that's okay. See, teaching them that it's incorrect, you see Paul doing that all the time. That also pressures somebody to engage in the practice. But that's acceptable. And that's acceptable because it's a different kind of pressure. It's a different kind of pressure than modeling the behavior in that person's presence. There is a different social and psychological dynamic. So teaching somebody thinks that something's sinful and it's not. Teaching them that, you say, well, you can't teach them that because you might harm them. No, I'm trying to raise them up in the faith. You see, but that's a different thing than me engaging in that conduct in their face before I've raised them up in the faith. And I think that's an important thing. So if, for example, let's say that there's a brother who cannot play cards with a clear conscience. You may think that's crazy, but there are people raised that way, whatever. Cannot play cards. Gin, rummy, anything. And let's say there's a brother or sister like that. Well, one is free to play cards outside of that brother's presence. And to not worry about it. Enjoy your liberty. But what you're not free to do is to invite him over and play cards in his face. Now you can stick that with drinking alcohol and a lot of other things. You see, free to engage in the liberty that the person has, but not free to bring him over and do it in the brother's face. Third, he's speaking of personal conduct that the brother or sister with a narrower conscience can be induced to imitate. That's the danger, you see. By doing it here in your presence, I'm going to induce you to do it, and you will do it before your conscience is ready, and that is sinning, and you may sear your conscience and lead to your destruction. Okay, so it's conduct that's done that this person can be induced to imitate. Now, some things are thought by some to be wrong only for the church, only for the congregational entity to do. Okay, a person may believe, for example, that it's sinful for a church to incorporate, or that it's sinful for a church to have a kitchen. Now, he has no problem with individual Christians incorporating and with individual Christians having kitchens. He just thinks it's wrong for the church to do so. Okay, I don't see those situations. I see those things as being outside the scope of Paul's teaching here and in Romans chapter 14 and 15, because an individual cannot act as a church. An individual cannot act as a congregation, and thus the Christian with the narrower conscience cannot be induced to imitate that behavior so as to violate his conscience. So someone comes in and says, hey, I've been studying and I think that the church can't have a kitchen, and you therefore have to get rid of the kitchen, otherwise you're sinning against what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 8 and Romans 14 and 15. Okay, I'd have to say, you're misunderstanding. You see, you're applying that to a situation that Paul would not apply it to. Last thing, fourth, he's speaking of optional conduct. He's assuming that for the purposes of argument here. Again, this is not optional conduct. It is sinful for them to go to the idol feast. He's assuming it's optional for a teaching moment. Okay, he's assuming it's that way. But speaking of optional conduct, the foregoing of, he's speaking of that kind of optional conduct, the foregoing of which does not leave one with only a more substantially burdensome way of obeying a divine command. Now that's where I would put the dispute over one cup versus multiple cups. That's where I would put that. Unlike abstaining from idol feasts, from temple feasts, or from meat and wine, in Romans chapter 14 and 15, for the sake of a brother's narrower conscience, abstaining from multiple cups, you either got multiple cups or one cup. Right? So abstaining from multiple cups leaves only the one cup option for obeying the command to participate in the Lord's Supper, which for many people is a significant emotional hindrance to taking the supper. It's not a matter of their conscience, but it is an emotional hindrance to them because they are completely grossed out and don't want to do it. They're fearing disease, and so even if they do it, you have distracted them from what they're to be engaged in. And there is no comparable burden on a divine command for these other situations if I don't go to the idol feast. So I would just say to somebody who says, hey, I've been studying and I think that we have to take one cup, therefore you're sinning. I would say, no, I don't think Paul is addressing that type of situation. So I don't think you can come and compel me and say, by the way, you're sinning if you don't now go to one cup. You see, but these are the kinds of questions that come up, and it makes us so nervous. But don't forget the principle. Out of love, we have to defer to the narrower conscience of our brothers and sisters. That's what it means to love them. Thanks for hanging in.